There has been a dramatic increase in hate motivated crimes and multiple forms of extremism across the globe. What are the trends that are breeding hate worldwide? Ontario Tech University launched the Centre on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. It's a research facility providing capacity to study these trends, engage with the community, foster innovative thinking, and enable real impact. Dr. Barbara Perry is a professor with Ontario Tech University's Faculty of Social Science and Humanities, and she is the director of the University Centre on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. Thanks so much, Dr. Perry, for taking some time for us today.
Well, thank you for asking me to join you today.
Well, the goal of the center is to explore the ways in which hate, bias, and extremism challenge values of inclusion and equity. What is the research saying about increases in hate crimes? How long has data been collected? And can we even guesstimate the numbers that go unreported?
Well, I should start by saying that, well, the center was started in 2018. I've been working in the area of hate studies for almost 30 years now, 25 years for sure. And so, I've seen the trends come and go in the US and Canada as well. In the Canadian context, it's a bit of a challenge because we've really only been reporting on hate crime officially, shall we say, since about 2006. So, that's only about 15 years, which is, it's kind of a challenge to get a sense of the true dynamics, and we can talk about the limitations of the data perhaps later. But I think if we look at the last couple of years in particular, there are real reasons for concern. We saw in the data pretty stable numbers over the last 10 years or so, 10 or 12 years. But suddenly in 2016, from 2016 to 2017, we saw a 47% increase in hate crime, a bit of a decrease the next year, and then the 2019 data just came out. We've seen another increase. All evidence is suggesting, another dramatic increase in 2020. If we look at just anti-Asian violence, for example, Vancouver Police Department are reporting a 717% increase in violence perpetrated against Asian communities. Toronto is saying probably around 400% increase. So, these numbers just climb, and it's not just about changes in public reporting and changes in police reporting. There is something else going on there because we see similar patterns in unofficial data. So data collected by National Council of Canadian Muslims or B'nai B'rith, for example, looking at anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish hate crimes in particular. So there is, there's that indicator. There's dramatic increases in the number and activities of far-right extremist groups and hate groups. So, a whole array of indicators, manifestations of hatred in its worst form, right, in terms of the violence and the verbal violence even directed towards communities.
And you're talking about the worst form, but we're talking about a wide spectrum here from microaggression all the way up to murder. What is at the root of these increases? What are the motivators behind hate crimes?
Yeah, I think it's multi-layered. There are so many factors, so many issues sort of accumulating, if you will. So we've got this cluster of problems that are emerging, grievances that people have, perhaps, if we want to put it in those terms. So even before the pandemic, there were concerns about changes in demographics. So we had this discourse about a refugee crisis in the Canadian context, for example, that was being exploited to instill fear around immigration generally, around Muslims, around people of color who were immigrating. So we had that. We of course had the narratives filtering up from the south of us during the, not the last, but the second, well, the last one as well, but the 2015-2016 presidential election, and throughout that whole administration, that was certainly influencing public opinion here and discourses, popular discourses in the Canadian context. So you've got those narratives that are shaping increases in hate. We have economic crises that have been affecting different elements of the community. communities. So the oil sector, for example, in Western Canada, and that motivated the rise of the Yellow Vest movement, which in and of itself was grounded in very legitimate concerns, but was also then co-opted very much by the far right and inserted those narratives around immigrants and people of color in particular. Right now, of course, it's the pandemic that has exacerbated some of those economic anxieties, as we've seen millions of jobs lost, thousands of businesses that may never recover. So that feeds into it. The conspiracy theories that are circulating, anti-Semitic, anti-Asian, anti-state. It's just, there's this grocery list really of issues that have been exploited and in some respects almost exacerbated by ideologues to justify and enable these forms of hostility and hatred.
Well, and as you say, many of them interact and also intersect, compounding the complexity of the issue. There's also been an increase in the number of hate groups, recruitment efforts, demonstrations, and those, as you say, who throw fire, who fan the flames of the fire, rather. Would you say that this growth that we're experiencing right now is unprecedented?
I believe it is. I think in the Canadian context, the last time that we saw, real concentrated activity of the far right was really in the 90s around groups like the Heritage Front. But, it certainly didn't reach the numbers, didn't reach the either the breadth or the depth of the impact that it's had in recent years. And part of that has to do with much more ready access to social media now. In 1990, that was really the infancy still of the internet, and social media really wasn't a thing. We had email, but certainly we didn't have things like Twitter and Facebook and all of those sorts of platforms that allow for a much more web-like, if you will, to use no pun intended, but a sort of a web-like networking of like-minded individuals. It's become much easier to promote your ideologies, to share it extensively with not just within your circle, but to other circles as well. Whether it's through Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever now sort of the fringe elements like Telegram and Gab. So those have become really important in terms of recruitment, but also in terms of internal strategizing and within the movement, as well as building that sense of solidarity and belonging, and I'm going to say brotherhood because they're primarily male groups. But it's really solidified that a shared identity that folks are really seeking, I think, when they come to these movements. So I think social media has had a great deal to do with the ability to exploit those concerns and anxieties in a way that brings people to the movement.
Well, as you say, much of the propaganda, ideology, and recruitment efforts are on social media sites. There have been, though, positive steps forward in terms of deplatforming. Has it gone far enough? Is there still a long way to go?
Well, there's still an awful lot of hate speech online, and it's not all associated with organized far right groups. So a lot of it is much more difficult, much more challenging to limit, because it's individuals posting really offensive messaging, harmful, dangerous, hurtful messaging that promotes violence, that promotes hatred, that sort of thing. So those individual pieces are much more difficult to identify and sort of remove, if you will. And I think we need to be aware of the downside of deplatforming the groups as well, in terms of feeding into their sense of victimhood, but also sending them further underground. So it's even more difficult to monitor them and to really know what they're up to, what they're planning, what their strategies are. Not to say that we shouldn't do it, but we need to be aware of what the consequences are and how it makes our jobs even more difficult in some respects.
Well, and I think a lot of times we find people behind keyboards feeling like they can say things online that they wouldn't say to a person in person. When does microaggression or freedom of expression cross the line to hate? And do the laws differ in Canada as compared to the US?
Yeah, very different here, and this is one of the things that has become a sort of I guess a point of challenge for me, or point of discomfort for me, is that Canadians also sort of try to espouse that American absolutism almost around freedom of speech. We are not bound by the American Constitution. We do have legitimate constraints on freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and it's not just about stifling dissent or different opinions. What I'm talking about here is hate speech. It's harmful speech. It's dangerous speech. And I think that's the way to understand it and to think about it. It is speech that has a real potential and the actuality of resulting in violence perpetrated against targeted communities, those that are identified in this hate speech. And our courts have been very clear in identifying what hate speech is, what that dangerous speech is. It's speech that vilifies particular communities, that subjects them to additional layers of hatred and hostility, and that has the potential to promote violence against those communities as well. There was a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case that identified 11 hallmarks of hate that are very explicit in terms of what precedents have been set around defining hate speech. And I think we need to look very closely at that and remember that, yeah, there are ways to identify and define hate speech. It's not as blurry a line as many would have us think that it is.
Well, under your leadership, the center has been largely leading the way in terms of research into this area. What interventions have you seen that are yielding signs of hope? And what further solutions are required from both a national and an international perspective?
I think there's a lot left to be done sort of at the national stage, if you will. I mean, we do have the anti-racism action plan, those sorts of pieces. I think Heritage Canada in particular is doing some, funding some interesting initiatives in this area. Public safety, I got to give them a plug. They've funded our work. They've believed in us, for what's this, their second project for, close to 10 years now. They've really supported the work we do around right-wing extremism. So, there are some initiatives at the federal level, but I think a lot of what is especially powerful is often happening at the local level, in terms of, providing supports for or interventions for people who are, going down that path. Groups like Yorktown Family Services in Toronto, John Howard Society in Ottawa, for example, Life After Hate, which really engages directly with people trying to come out of the movement. I think there are some strategies, if we're talking about the online space in particular. One of the issues for me has really been the need for a critical digital literacy, enhancing our ability, not just of youth, but adults as well, to be much more reflective about what's crossing their screens and what they share. I think we just sort of automatically, and we get a Twitter or a tweet and we pass it on without really stopping to think about what it is that we're sharing. What's the source of that information? Because there's so many, baseless conspiracy theories circulating right now. I think we have a responsibility to really unpack that and do our own fact checking, if you will, to determine the credibility of the source and the credibility of the science that might underlie some of that. And I think we don't do that enough. So people need to be encouraged to do it, and they need to be given the tools to do it. And I think there are a lot of local agencies that are doing that for particular portions of the population, some working, with youth, some with adults. So, these are really important initiatives as well. So, I mean, there's, I think, a sort of endless creativity going on, but it's often in, these small pockets, these isolated pockets. And I think that perhaps we do need more leadership at the federal level and perhaps even at the provincial levels to help shape more such initiatives and fund such initiatives, because they're, especially when you're talking about media and big tech, the interventions can be expensive in terms of having the expertise to help set up effective. I mean, for example, we're working now with John Howard Society and Boys and Girls Club and Yorktown Family Services to develop a sort of a counter counter-narrative gaming platform, because there are so many platforms out there that are luring kids in particular, and some adults, into those narratives through the gaming. So we want to construct, alternative anti-racist game, if you will, but also a safe gaming curriculum that we can share with youth. So, that's another kind of initiative specifically in the social media sphere.
Well, as you say, there is a need for the tools, the supports, and the resources to deal with the issue of hate. And we thank you, Dr. Perry, for all that you do and all that your team does in this regard. We really appreciate that you would take the time for NewsPoint 360 today.
Sure. Thank you.